Hi everybody, welcome back and welcome to chapter 6. So in our previous chapter, we did our third pass on the vehicle, which was essentially grouping everything, naming everything, getting all of our UVs in check, and we then mirrored all of our geometry over to the other side, and we then updated our UV set to match that, and we have everything grouped accordingly. So we've got our left side, our right side, and our center pieces. So now that we have everything in a good spot, we could actually check this in as is. This is good to go. We can publish this model into the model library at whichever studio we were working at, and we can essentially call this done. But something I thought was worth covering is the idea of asset variations. What we mean by asset variations are essentially our clean version, which is our default asset, and our damaged asset. So we could check this in as our default version. So this would be our default truck, but we might have shots where we see this truck actually a bit bashed up, maybe some battered panels. We might have several stages where the damage gets worse throughout the chase sequence. So the way that we would account for that is by having several stages of damage variant vehicles. So we'd have our clean version as our default asset, we'd then have maybe damage variant 1, we'd have damage variant 2, which is more battered, and maybe damage variant 3, where we have even more significant damage to the vehicle. That is how we would set up our damage variants. And each of these variants would use the same texture set, it would use the same rig, it would use all of the same geometry. We would just be removing pieces of geometry or altering the topology as we go along to reflect that damage that we see in those shots. So we're not going to be spending a ton of time doing a damage pass, we're just going to be spending time going through the difference between a clean asset and a damage variant, and I'll just alter some pieces just to give you an idea of what sort of process we would go through to achieve that. And then when we're happy with that, we can essentially prep the model for checking it in if we were at studio. So we can freeze all the transforms again, we can delete the history, we can center all of the pivots, we can clean up all of our normals as well, so we can soften everything just to make sure that when we render it, or if we were passing it over to textures, they wouldn't have any normal issues when they're painting their maps. And then we can call this chapter done, and we can move on to the final chapter, which will be rendering the vehicle. So first things first, I thought I would just show you the asymmetrical pieces that we needed to add back in as well. So that was the fuel tank here, which is on the right side only. I've quickly just modeled that in there. And here's some reference just to show you that. And then also on the front side, we've removed that oil drum that's on the left side. So we've only got that inlet fan that you can see there. That's the only difference I can tell between these two sides. Other than that, the interior just needed a basic tweak just to remove that dint in the dashboard, but that was it. And that's basically it for any of our asymmetrical pieces. So I've added the UVs for those new parts to a fresh tile, and we can call that done now for both sides. And I've also gone to the right side of the vehicle just to alter things like the wing mirror, the headlamps a little bit, just to knock them around slightly, just to make them match the reference a bit closer, since they were all slightly offset and slightly bent on our reference. So it was just a quick fix to make those line up just a little bit nicer. And I'm happy with how this looks now, so we can cover the variants that I spoke about before. So all we'd have to do is just take our default truck that we have here, our nice clean truck, we can duplicate this mesh, and then we can rename this to something like damaged or variant damaged or var damaged. I'll go with var damaged for now. And then once we're happy with that, we can go in there, and this is where we can add some of those sculptural details just to cause some damage, some wear and tear, and we would generally match this to what's happening in the shots. So we can open up the plates and take a look at the action and just take a look at what sort of details we have to get in there. So maybe we can peel up this bonnet, so we can use our sculpting tools just to knock some dents into the front there. Maybe it's bashed into a corner, and it's important to make sure that we have enough geometry here to allow us to add in these dents. So this is also a good opportunity to find out if we're going to have enough topology to use when we have our damage variants set up, because each of these models will use the same rig and the same textures. So it's important that we try and work with what we've got from the get-go. We can't really add anything to it when we do our variants. So we have to make sure that when we check in our initial default model, we have enough topology there for this. So we need to make sure that we have enough topology, but also, as you can see here, we might need to add like an engine or some internal pieces and things like that, just in case they get exposed. So we might want to see those extra details as well. And not only will it cover us for damage variants like this, but it also covers shot sculpting. So shot sculpting is where we need to take our model and actually sculpt in some of these damages happening in real time in the shot. So we might have to animate some of these bumpers crumpling, animate some of the door panels getting hit by something in the plate. We'd have to keep up with the damage that we see in the shot. So shot sculpting is one way to add in these damage details. But there are obviously cases where we can't do all of these damage details in a shot sculpt. We'd actually have to have our own asset variant with all of these damages baked into the geometry. So for example here, if I duplicate this mesh again, we could have this as our var damaged 2, and this could be where we have another layer of that damage happening that we might see happen to the real truck in the plates. We'd obviously have to mimic these damages in our variants. So let's say in our var damaged 1, we see this truck knock over like a post or a bollard or something on that left side, and then our damage variant 2 might be the second phase of that damage happening. It could also be an important story moment as well, right? Because if we're having a chase sequence happen with this truck, there's going to be several stages of damage that happens across that sequence, and we have to make sure that we accurately reflect that damage between our CG truck and the plate truck. So if we're going to be doing CG takeovers between the plate and our CG, and then the plate and then our CG, we just have to make sure that we have that continuity reflected between the two. So it has to make sense between what happens at the start of the chase with the clean truck and what happens at the end when we have our damaged truck. So assuming we were happy with this damage, we've matched it to the references or matched it to the plate nicely, we would do a quick submission of this damage. We'd show our lead and then our supervisor, and if everybody's happy with how it looks and if we're matching the plate nicely, we'd go ahead and check this model in as this damage variant. So that's how we would do that. And you might also think, well, what about textures? Because they might be squashed, they might be stretching too much. If that's the case, and we do see that stretching, that's when the texture artist would also do a texture variant just to cover those areas. Sometimes it's actually okay and we can get away with it, but if we do see some stretching, or if we're close up enough in this shot that we can see that stretch, that's when we'd go in and we'd patch those textures up. And like I mentioned, if we didn't have enough geometry there to play with when we do shot sculpting or damage variants, that's when we'd have to go back to the original model, so our default model. We could smooth a bunch of panels, we can add some extra edge loops, but we'd have to push it back through textures, back through rigging, and that can get quite messy if we do that later on in the show. So it doesn't hurt to have that geometry there at the start. It's just another example of what I've been talking about throughout this series, about how in models especially, we have to be very preemptive, we have to sort of see into the future and make sure we cover all of our bases, or at least as many of them as we can, at the earliest point that we can in the show, because that's going to make everybody's life a lot easier in the other departments, and it's also going to help us later on. And that was just a quick introduction to damage variants or variants of any kind that studios typically work with, and you can do this in your personal work as well if you need to. So we don't need those right now, we can get rid of those and we can focus on our default truck. And all we're going to do now is we're going to soften all of the normals, we'll unlock those normals again, we'll freeze our transforms, we'll delete our history, and we can either assign one single shader to this entire vehicle, or we might want to go one step further and actually have multiple shaders representing each of those materials that we grouped our UVs by earlier. So wood, for example, metal, glass, rubber, leather, we could have materials for each of those. That can help with Substance Painter because we can break it out into each material. For simplicity though, we're just going to stick with one shader on this vehicle. First things first, we can select our group, and depending on the density of each object that you model, you can either select the top group and go to soften normals, or you might have to do it group by group because Maya can sort of struggle if there's too many pieces of geometry. So we can select our group, we can go to mesh display, and we can go to soften edge. It might take a little moment just to kick in, but when it's done, we'll have our mesh softened. So we can go ahead and do the same thing again on our right side. So we'll just select that top group again, we can go to mesh display and we can hit soften, or we can use the G key on the keyboard. So G repeats the last operation that you did. So softening the normals, freezing the transforms, centering pivot, the G key can actually do that same operation. And then we can move on to our last group, which is our center. We can hit the G key again just to soften those normals, and then we're done. And as you can see, our vehicle looks a lot nicer now without all those random hard edges from the modeling process. All the normals are nice and soft now because we've just fixed them all. So now we can go ahead and just unlock all of the normals one more time just to make sure nothing's caught in there. And then we can just delete our history one last time. So we can do Shift Alt D, or we can go to delete by type and history. And something else that's really important is that we have to make sure that our asset is at the center of world space and that the tires are actually meeting the bottom of where the ground plane is. So we're just going to shift everything up. We'll go into our side view, make sure the bottom of the tires is touching that plane, and then we have our asset in a good spot for publishing. And the reason for this is because we have to have consistency across the origin point of all of our assets. So they all have to be zeroed out, they all need to be at the center of world space, and they all have to consistently meet that plane. And you might notice that our tires are not deflated at the bottom, and the reason for that is because the rigging team generally have deformers that can actually flatten the tire at the bottom and give it a sense of weight, or we can do that as a simulation in our shots. And all that's left to do now is just add a single shader to the entire vehicle. So we can just go ahead and just use a standard surface shader, or if you're exporting it to send to a client or anything like that, they might want to have something more universal, like a Lambert or a Blinn, but we're just going to stick with a standard surface shader. And you might have noticed that we've removed our reference cameras as well at this point, so they're saved in our working scene. We don't need them in this scene. So now that we've got everything finished, we can go ahead and optimize the scene one last time just to flush everything out, make sure nothing else is in the scene other than the model. And assuming that your lead and your supervisors are happy with this asset, we can go ahead and open our tool to check this model into the library. And once we have this published, we're done for now. So we might have to keep an eye on it and address any notes that come back to us from the other departments. We might have to do those damage variants that I spoke about. But as of right now, we can call this asset finished. And that's it for this chapter. So it's a shorter one. We just needed to go over the publishing methods for our model. But in our last chapter, we'll cover the rendering. So typically in a show or a production, we would do the rendering first to get that approved by the supervisors, and then we would check that in. But for the sake of this tutorial series, it made more sense just to show you how we'd prep the model, and then at the end we can do some nice renders just to wrap things up. And there we have it. So that's the end of chapter 6. I hope it all made sense. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in chapter 7.